Jonathan, let me
so
finish.
Either stop saying my name.
You will be remembered no differently than the officers of the Third Reich.
I know you rehearsed that line.
Oh, come
I'm sure you
on,
rehearsed
man.
that line, but it's really pitiful. And I'm a bit insulted that that is what you've come up with against me. Really?
It's not offensive at all. If you want to not be compared to Nazis, stop acting like Nazis. It's very simple.
I think you're consumed
No, you
by
are,
hatred
my
and
friend.
the fact that in
The world has
beginning,
woken
when-
up, my friend. The
when
world has
peers-
woken up.
Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to be remembered as a Churchill that saved not only Israel from radical Islam, but also Western civilization.
She is a self-described Zionist fanatic, someone who has a long history of being a pro-Israel ideologue, who just ran a piece saying the starvation in Gaza is fake. That level of bias being brought to 60 Minutes, to CBS, I think there'll be a lot more censorship of Palestinian voices than there already is.
It's now 2 years since Hamas breached the Israeli border and unleashed pure hell. The terrorists inflicted suffering and atrocities which were previously unimaginable on victims who committed no crime. In the 24 bitter months that have followed, few can dispute that Israel's now done the same. War was inevitable. A response, as I've said many times, was justified. The same cannot be said of the starvation and civilian slaughter which have decimated Israel's international standing and brought anger and evil to our streets. A sickening attack on a synagogue in Manchester last week was followed quickly by an attack on a Sussex mosque. Hate-filled protests have routinely reached cities across the world. Anybody with a heart knows this can't go on. And the 2-year anniversary of October the 7th coincides with the biggest chance yet to finally bring this misery to an end. How close that end really is and how permanent that end will be are the subjects we're focusing on for the next hour, as well as the very real possibility, foreshadowed for so long, that an end to the war may be the beginning of the end for Netanyahu too. Well, joining me now is Zateo Editor-in-Chief and CEO Mehdi Hassan. Mehdi, great to have you back on Uncensored. It feels like an historic moment, not just because it's the second anniversary, but because there is a peace plan which is being taken very seriously by all sides, it would seem, and which you yourself have already conceded. There are parts of this plan that you approve of. So let's go through this. Tell me what you like and what you don't like about the plan.
Piers, appreciate you having me on. It's an important day, it's an important week, and it is an important plan if it can stop the violence. I just want to say one thing about your intro. You said Hamas breached Israel's border on October the 7th. Technically, Israel is the only country I know of that doesn't define its borders. It breached the fence, but Israel has never said whether it accepts that Gaza is not Israeli territory. It is actually Palestinian territory. And that comes to the plan itself, which is a plan that Donald Trump tried to get signed off with Arab governments, as you know, Piers, and then when he released it, Israel had made some edits. So it's not great to have a plan that's written by Tony Blair and Jared Kushner and edited by Benjamin Netanyahu. Clearly, it's not great for the Palestinians. But in a situation where there is a genocide going on, people like myself, we want an end to the fighting. I'm not Palestinian. Let me just be very clear. Palestinians get to decide what happens to their future, whether they fight, whether they cease fire, whether they sign a peace deal. That is up to the Palestinian people. But just looking at it from an analytical point of view, there are good things in the plan. An end to the fighting, top of them, a resumption of aid, a release of hostages and detainees on all sides. We all want that, right? An end to starvation, we hope. By the way, the plan says that if the plan is agreed, aid will be fully resumed, which is a concession, Piers. The aid hasn't been fully resumed,
right.
Unlike all the Israelis who've been on your show and told you, oh, aid, there's enough aid. Well, why does the plan say that aid has to go up then, has to be resumed? Anyways, park that for a moment. Those are the good things. End to violence, end to starvation, I hope, would be the good things. The bad things are that it's a very colonial plan. A lot of Palestinians have described it to me as colonial. Tony Blair and Donald Trump should have nothing to do with the running of Gaza. This plan puts them on some board of peace. I think you and I would agree that Tony Blair has been nothing but a disaster for the Middle East. To bring him back here is insanity. And of course, when you look at the plan itself, Piers, it's not a peace plan, because peace requires a settlement to the conflict. It requires justice for the Palestinian people. It requires an end to the occupation. This plan does not do that, right? Netanyahu himself has told the Israelis there's nothing in this plan that says statehood. There's a vague mention of it, Piers, where it says if the Palestinian Authority reforms itself, if Gaza's redeveloped, if Israel decides there's no resumption of terror, then there will be a pathway to peace and statehood. It's all very vague. It's very conditional. It doesn't deal with the core issue, which I've been telling you on your show for over a year now is the occupation. Hamas is not the core issue. Hamas is a symptom of the core issue. The core issue is occupation. And this plan does nothing for that. It also leaves Israel in control of at least 20% of the territory, maybe a majority. I mean, Amit Segal, who's a journalist very close to Benjamin Netanyahu, he said over the weekend, this leaves Israel in control of the majority of the Strip as long as we want.
Do you agree with the general consensus that Hamas can play no part in any government going forward in either Gaza or the West Bank?
Hamas agrees to that, Piers. So the difference between what Hamas has offered to Biden and Trump and what Trump has come up with, and this is where the big sticking point is, Hamas has always agreed to a hostage release deal, all for all, they call it. We'll release all the hostages if you release all the Palestinian detainees who you've illegally taken, including the ones since October the 7th, which are mentioned in this plan, thankfully. That's one thing they've always offered, and it's in this plan. The other thing they've always offered is we won't be part of government. Have an independent committee of Palestinian technocrats, independent, non-political folks, not from the PA, not from Hamas, not from Fatah. They agreed to that. Israeli negotiators have admitted they agreed to that. The Americans have admitted that. What's different in this deal is the demilitarization point, right? The Israelis added this in at the very late stage, which is you must give up all your weapons at the very beginning of this ceasefire. That's the sticking point, which Hamas, in their statement on Friday, Piers, you saw, haven't signed up to. That's what they're going to be arguing about now in the coming days. But in terms of not being part of the government, Hamas already agreed to that, Piers. We could have had this deal under Biden. We could have had this deal in January when Trump came into office with his ceasefire that the Israelis then broke. This deal's been on the table, a version of it, for over a year and a half now. Matthew Miller, the former Biden State Department spokesman, who you know, he said that. You know, that even there, Netanyahu came along and added poison pills. The Israelis have added poison pills throughout. Hostages' families, you've interviewed the families of hostages, I've interviewed the families of hostages. They said it consistently, that we could have had a deal, but Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir Smotrich, they blocked it at every turn.
And it seems to me that one of the pivotal moments in changing the narrative here and speeding things up was the extraordinarily ill-advised attack on Doha by the Israelis when they were trying to take out the Hamas commanders as they were literally meeting to discuss the peace plan. And they failed in that mission. They killed a Qatari security serviceman in the process, along with other people who were not involved at all with Hamas. And the opprobrium that they got them, not just from the Middle East, where there was complete outrage, and in particular, obviously, in Qatar, but also from apparently President Trump, who blew up in a fury at Netanyahu. You know, it would be truly ironic if that act of, in my view, just completely indefensible, I mean, illogical, to be honest with you, attack on Doha, if that turns out to be the catalyst for getting the deal done.
Yeah, so let me agree and disagree with you. I agree with you, Piers, that it was indefensible, and it would be ironic if that leads to some kind of end to the fighting. It's not illogical, though, Piers. I just want your viewers to understand. If you are an expansionist Israeli government, you don't want peace with the Palestinians. You don't want peace with the Lebanese. You don't want peace in the region. You want to keep expanding. Piers, you may have seen Benjamin Netanyahu recently said in an interview, he supports the idea of a greater Israel, which is a batshit crazy idea that some people used to say was a conspiracy theory on the Israeli far right. It was only mad people like Smotrich. The Prime Minister of Israel said recently in an interview he supports the idea of greater Israel, which means taking territory from Syria and Lebanon, maybe Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and creating a greater Israel, even bigger than they already have illegally. So it's not illogical from that point of view that you wouldn't want to do a peace deal. They always kill the negotiators. Piers, I came on your show after they bombed Iran, and I told you about Ali Shamkhani, who was the main nuclear negotiator, who was negotiating with the Americans. Trump had shared a tweet praising his position, and Israel targeted him. They thought they killed him. Actually, he survived. But they always target negotiators. They killed, last year, they killed Haniyeh in Tehran when he was leading the negotiations. They attacked, as you point out, in Doha, the Hamas negotiating team who were meeting to discuss negotiations. Go back to 2012. They killed a guy called Ahmed Jabari from Hamas who was in the middle of signing off on a permanent truce with Israel. They killed him. There's a long history of Israel undermining negotiations, ceasefires, truces. So it's not illogical because they don't actually want peace. And Netanyahu in D.C., Piers, you saw last week when Trump announces this deal, he says it's a great day in history. It'll bring, classic hyperbole and bombast from Trump. Netanyahu goes and does a video in Hebrew and says, hey, we got to win here. We're not leaving the Strip. And then the guy behind the camera says, what about statehood? He goes, there's nothing for statehood in this plan. You remember what they used to say about Arafat, Piers? That he says one thing in Arabic and another thing in English. Netanyahu's the master of that. He tells the Western media and Trump what they want to hear in English, and then he tells his right-wing base and his cabinet in Hebrew, yeah, we're not going anywhere. This is not a peace deal.
Let me play devil's advocate with Tony Blair for a moment, because I, as you know, opposed the Iraq War very vociferously, and I believe that was the beginning of the end of his tenure and reputation in the UK, certainly. But it's interesting to chart what's happened with him since. He became a Middle East peace envoy. He's put an awful amount of hours and time and effort into trying to resolve a difficulty over there. And all right, it's like putting the fox in the hen coop. I totally get all that. I do remember having a long conversation with him before I went to interview Netanyahu for CNN, where his understanding of the conflict and the difficulties and the problems, everything, was extraordinary. There's no doubt about that. And I'm also reminded of what he achieved in Northern Ireland, which was another seemingly intractable problem between the Protestants and the IRA, and no one thought it could ever be resolved. And Blair put the yards in, put the hours in, worked with Clinton, worked with Mitchell and the others, and they finally got a deal done. You know, sometimes, you know, and in that deal, of course, Martin McGuinness and Jerry Adams, who'd been, you know, senior IRA figures, became, you know, senior politicians. So there's a kind of, you know, there's a background here which I think has to be taken in totality. Is it completely insane that somebody like him can form a group which at least supervise a transition, potentially, hopefully, to a place where Palestine gets a recognisable state of its own?
So, big picture, I think the entire idea of Trump, Blair, anyone else on this board is insane. The whole problem with Palestine is it's a legacy of colonialism. We don't need more Western colonialism. We need more self-determination. If you want to bring in local Arab countries, fine. Even that will be problematic. But really, it has to be led by people on the ground, not by outsiders. Donald Trump couldn't find Gaza on a map if his life depended on it. And Tony Blair, let me deal with Blair specifically. So, obviously, you and I opposed the Iraq War. It was a disaster. He lied. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a war crime. Tony Blair should be heading to The Hague, not to Gaza. I wrote a piece for Zeteo laying out the case against Blair being involved in the future of Gaza. People can read it at zeteo.com. I will just be very brief and say this. He has hundreds of thousands of Arabs' blood on his hands. The idea that you would go to Gaza, where Arabs are being killed for the last 2 years, and that Blair, of all people, has any credibility with the Palestinian people. I've not met a single Palestinian who views him as anything other than a war criminal. And even if you put Iraq to one side, you mentioned his Middle East envoy role for the quartet between 2007 and 2015. It was a complete failure. Everyone agrees it was a failure. Go back and read the Financial Times editorial the day he resigned. They said it was a complete failure. He got nothing done. He was seen as just a proxy for the Israelis. He would say whatever the Israelis wanted. And that leads me to my last point. You rightly raised Northern Ireland. The reason he succeeded with Mo Mowlam and Clinton and Jonathan Powell and others in Northern Ireland is because Britain ended up being a fair broker. Both sides could trust them. Of course, both sides had their criticisms, the Unionists and the Sinn Féin side especially. But ultimately, Britain was trying to bring that conflict to an end in a way that involved talking to everyone. They've never applied that logic to the Middle East. Blair doesn't see Palestinians as equal to Israel. He is self-confessed a pro-Israel guy. This is the problem with all Western interventions when it comes to Palestine. They're never neutral brokers. The United States is not an impartial negotiator. To quote Aaron David Miller, a former Clinton negotiator, we are Israel's lawyer. That is what the US is. That is what the West is. That is certainly what Tony Blair is. So, yeah, he doesn't have any credibility. And by the way, don't even get me started on the conflicts of interest. The guy makes money from deals every time he's in the Middle East. Him and Jared Kushner have no credibility. They're both making money on side deals in the Middle East while they're trying to bring supposedly peace and redevelopment to Gaza. Zero credibility, Piers. It'll end in tears.
Talking of people making a lot of money, Barry Weiss, formerly of the New York Times, has just sold her free press business of just 4 years standing to Paramount. David Ellison has bought it, the new boss of Paramount, and she's been put in charge of CBS News. Some people on the pro-Palestinian side are very concerned because she has obviously very pro-Israeli history. Are you concerned, or are you also, given that you and I and others have made a similar leap into the brave world of individuals running their own kind of media entities, and she's obviously a massive success story in a very rapid period of time. What do you make of what's happened with Barry Weiss and the Free Press, and are you concerned about maybe whatever influence she may have on CBS News?
Yeah. No, I'm very concerned, and sorry to do a second plug for Zateo. I don't normally do this, but we just ran a big piece last night from my colleague Prem Tucker talking to insiders at CBS News who make the point that some of the stuff that Barry Weiss ran at the Free Press wouldn't even meet CBS editorial standards. They would get fired at CBS for running that stuff. CBS News it's not perfect. I have many criticisms of CBS News, like you do of all mainstream media, but they just ran a very good investigation last week, Piers, about how Israel bombed the flotilla in Tunisia, even denying it was them, but they spoke to US intelligence and showed that actually Netanyahu signed off on a drone strike on the flotilla. Is that the kind of story that Barry Weiss would publish under her reign at CBS News? She is a self-described, Zionist fanatic, right? The idea that a quote-unquote neutral media organization is led by someone who has a long history of being a pro-Israel ideologue, who has a history of trying to censor Palestinian voices when she was at university, who just ran a piece saying the starvation in Gaza is fake. It's not true. Nobody's starving in Gaza. That level of editorial standards, that level of bias being brought to 60 Minutes, to CBS, it's really worrying. And you and I, you do a show called Piers Uncensored. I think there'll be a lot more censorship of Palestinian voices than there already is now at CBS News with her in charge. David Ellison, the guy who's hired her, the son of Larry Ellison. Again, the Ellison family is very, very pro-Israel. Larry Ellison is the biggest single private donor to the Israeli military, to Friends of IDF. They've made very clear what their biases are. They've made very clear why they're hiring her. They've made very clear why they're buying TikTok. Because as you said in the introduction, Piers, public opinion is turning against Israel. So these folks are doubling down on messaging, doubling down on trying to control what we see and hear online and on TV. So it's very worrying for those of us who believe in free speech.
Well, let's see. I give her the benefit of the doubt. I tweeted her today to congratulate her on an amazing deal.
I saw.
Whatever people think, it's an amazing turnaround.
I mean, you and I know it's not worth You and I both know it's not worth $150 million. That is the Ellisons taking care of Barry Weiss.
You and I should absolutely pray that these businesses are worth that much in such a short period of time, because then you and I will be laughing all the way to the bank. But no, I do remember her being kind of forced out of the New York Times by the woke mob, and
That's false, Piers.
Well, it's not
she was
really.
Not forced out
it's
of the
not
New York
really.
Times.
It's not really. But anyway,
BS.
I will try. Like always, I'll give her the benefit of the doubt until or if she ever proves me wrong. So we'll see. I think it's going to be a hell of a rollercoaster ride with her in charge of CBS News. And honestly, if I'm honest about it, I think mainstream media in America, the mainstream news media in particular, has had a stick up its ass for a long time, and it's about time that stick got broken and they got brought into the real world. And it'll be interesting to see what happens.
She's not the solution. I agree with you about the stick in the arse. She is not the solution.
We shall see. Mehdi, great to have you back on Uncensored, always. Our continuing October the 7th coverage is Abby Martin, investigative journalist and host of the Empire Files, and Jonathan Conricus, the retired Lieutenant Colonel and IDF spokesman. Welcome to both of you. Both, of course, been on Uncensored numerous times before. Abby Martin, where are you with this deal? Do you believe this deal is workable, that it can actually be the start of lasting peace?
Well, of course, I welcome an end to the unrelenting slaughter and bloodletting for the past 2 years. There's been hundreds of October 7ths that have happened in Gaza. Of course, I welcome the cessation of massacres. The bare minimum demand for the last 2 years has been a ceasefire. So, of course, I welcome that. I think it's a big gamble by Hamas. I mean, this entire negotiations is basically putting Palestinians the barrel of a gun to their head and saying, subject, surrender, or die. First of all, no Palestinians were at the negotiating table. It was Gulf client states speaking on their behalf, Netanyahu and Kushner, who's personally invested in the settlement process. The whole gamble of releasing all the remaining hostages dead and alive within a 72-hour window is logistically insane. And of course, it's basically acting in good faith from the Israeli government, a pathologically lying, serial-killing state. Why should we believe anything that they say? They're saying they're not going to release any of the hostages, the 1,700 Palestinians they've been holding after October 7th, many women and children. Aside from that, they're talking about putting in a technocratic governing body by the likes of Tony Blair. I mean, this is basically cementing the subjugation of Palestinians, Piers. And I think the most cartoonish thing of all is the demand for full demilitarization of Hamas and other armed factions. I mean, basically what that is saying is that the precursor and justification for genocide is the notion of armed resistance. Jonathan, let me finish. the notion of armed resistance, which is a legally enshrined right in international law, that is not a justification or precursor for genocide. In what reality are we living in that the victims of a genocide are being asked to make concessions to the people committing genocide against them? If you do not agree at this point, 2 years in, that the state that needs to be demilitarized and de-radicalized, frankly, is not the state committing genocide, then you're part of the problem.
Okay, but on that last point, before I go to Jonathan, why should a group, Hamas, who perpetrated one of the worst terror attacks of modern times, why should they be entitled to any power at the end of all this? Why should they not demilitarize? Why should they not have all their arms taken away as part of a deal? I don't really understand the logic there. I mean, you can have your view about the Israeli government and the way the IDF has conducted this war, but why should Hamas have any rights to anything, frankly?
Well, Hamas already has said many, many times that they would completely relinquish governing authority. They have already said that they
But why should they keep their arms, though?
Gaza
That's
Strip.
the point.
That's not enough.
But why keep their arms?
Wait, why would they give up their arms without, hold on, why would they give up their arms without any sort of assurance for national statehood or sovereignty? Why would they do that, Piers? Why would you give up a right, a legally enshrined right to armed resistance to an illegal besiegement and occupation without any sort of assurances or promises of statehood?
Well, again, I'll come to Jonathan, and I will come to you, Jonathan, but I would argue that when you commit a terrorist act of that magnitude, then you abrogate all your rights to demand anything. And the Israeli government position...
Okay, so why is the logic not applied to the IDF?
Well, I'll come to Jonathan for that question in a moment, but I'm just curious why you would think that Hamas has any rights about any of this. I mean, surely when you do what they did on October the 7th 2 years ago, in that moment, you surrender your right to anything. You can ask for it, but you don't have any rights left. I mean, you're basically saying, we are a despicable terror group, we're committing this outrage, and we're going to kidnap and kill and maim and do all the rest of it, but at the end of it, we want rights to demand things. That's not really how it works with terror groups.
Well, that's exactly what Israel's doing. For the last 2 years, we've been seeing the most bloody genocide on steroids. This is Israel for who it is. This is their true nature and character. So why on earth do they get the right to make concessions? They are a rogue maniac state, killing all of their neighbors, bombing all of their neighbors. They need to be stopped. They need to be stopped. Why do they have any rights to demand concessions for the victims of the genocide that they're perpetrating, Piers?
Okay.
Why?
All right. Well, let me ask Jonathan, why?
Is that really the question, Piers, that you're asking me?
Well, I think it's an interesting flip question to the one I asked, which I didn't really get a satisfactory response to, which is that actually, to me, Hamas have no right to demand anything here. And clearly, the Netanyahu government position is that we will carry on pulverizing Gaza until the last Hamas terrorist is left dead in the ground, as long as that takes, and everybody is intent on trying to stop that happening because of the collateral damage to so many civilians and so much property and so on. But of course, the flip side is the argument comes back, well, prior to October the 7th, and since October the 7th in particular, the Israeli government, many people on the Palestinian side believe, have behaved like a rogue terror state themselves. So what right do they have to determine what happens here afterwards?
Yeah, I regret the parody. I think it's a totally false, dishonest, actually it's an absurd parody that is being made here. And I think it's very interesting to hear that, you know, even countries like Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, Pakistan, and a few other Muslim majority countries who have no long record of loving Israel or publishing positive statements or things that can be aligned with Israeli security interests, they are behind this initiative, and they are saying Hamas has no right to hold weapons, Hamas must be disarmed, Hamas should not govern the Gaza Strip, and Hamas must return all of the hostages. They're also asking, of course, demanding that Israel withdraw from the Gaza Strip and that there will be a pathway to a Palestinian state. And, you know, for most people who are normal and not consumed by Jew hatred and this feverish anger and hatred towards those annoying Jews who have their homeland in Israel, for most people who are sane, that makes sense. And it makes sense for Israel to actually dictate the terms against Hamas. It makes sense for Israel to defend itself, not only against October 7, but against an organization that has both written and said multiple times before October 7, during and after October 7, that it is their outspoken goal and intention to annihilate the Jewish state. So for me, there's really no question what needs to happen here. This war cannot and must not end without a defeated Hamas, without Hamas that is completely dismantled of its military capabilities, and without a fresh start for people in Gaza. And I think that those are the very basic prerequisites. We'll have to see now if Hamas, how clever they'll be able to be. And I think they maneuvered diplomatically pretty well. They said that they're going to return hostages. Teams are now in place in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and they're going to start discussing the details. But the Israeli and American, and actually Qatari condition is first hand over all the hostages, dead and murdered, and then we start negotiating on all of the long and very substantial list of the 21 points that remain. I hope that Hamas will do it. I hope that Hamas will be true to their words for once. I hope that they will return the hostages, those that they murdered and those that are still in captivity more than 2 years, suffering, starving, abused and everything. And I hope that they will be returned to their families. And then we can start looking at the withdrawal of Israeli forces, stopping military operations, and perhaps building a different Gaza. If you ask me if that's going to happen, what the chances are, we unfortunately have our experience, and we know that Hamas, they lie, they are deceitful, they're extremely cruel, and they will do everything they can to stay in power at the expense of the population in Gaza, at the expense of Palestinians. But I hope that for once in their short history, Hamas will do what's good for Gazans and not for the Muslim Brotherhood and not for Hamas itself. But we'll have to wait and see.
Abby, you were laughing a little inappropriately as he was talking about Hamas's need to release the hostages. Why would that be something that makes you laugh? I mean, surely that should be a prerequisite.
Oh, no, I wasn't laughing at that. No, Look, of course I want all hostages, both Palestinian and Israeli hostages, to be released. I wasn't laughing at that. I was laughing at the audacity of Jonnathan to just gaslight and lie and project everything that Israelis are doing onto Hamas and onto Palestinians. The audacity to look at Gaza today, which is completely demolished. We just saw the finance minister saying the demolition's done. Now the real estate bonanza begins. Netanyahu has said, bragging over and over again, we're not going to withdraw. You think we're going to withdraw? It's a joke, Jonnathan. The world knows you are lying. You have lost the plot. You know who can't come home? The 17,000 children that Israelis have slaughtered. So all of this is it's just absolutely insane that 2 years into this, we all know that you're committing genocide. The only people who won't accept that it's a genocide are Israelis. And you know what? I think that you know it's a genocide, Jonnathan. I think you just support it. You want the genocide.
Abby, let me just jump in there. Abby, on this issue of genocide, you are aware that no country has ever been found guilty of actual genocide, are you?
What point is this question?
That even in Rwanda,
what is the point of that question? We know
it was determined that the legal threshold for a genocide was not met. Every single genocide
scholar, even though, so
my point is that
you're looking at Gaza today and you're saying that you've agreed that it's a genocide, Piers.
No, I've never agreed that. I've said that I believe what has been going on.
Sure.
No, because simply for the reason I've just stated, there has never been a legally determined genocide declared.
Okay, let's get him to court. Let's go to court with Israel.
That's what I think.
Let's see the evidence.
That's what I think would be sensible, right? I think it would be sensible to do that and actually get a legal ruling about whether it constitutes genocide. I believe the Israeli government...
100%.
I would welcome that, Piers, by the way.
And Jonnathan and I have discussed this. I just think that it gets thrown around all the time and people get attacked for not saying it's a genocide. I get stopped by people in the street, call it a genocide. To me, what has gone on has become an increasingly massively disproportionate response to the terror attack 2 years ago.
92% civilians killed. 92% civilians have been killed, Piers. That is unprecedented in any modern conflict.
Well, we don't know the exact numbers.
False.
The numbers that I've read are that approaching 25 to 30,000 of the 60 or so thousand who've been killed are Hamas. here's my point about that. We don't actually know, because actually the refusal by the Israeli government, and Jonathan, I know, agrees with me on this point, the refusal to allow international journalists into Gaza to verify this stuff is one of the biggest problems of this war. We just don't know what these numbers are. And it's an ongoing running sore that journalists can't do their job and get to the truth. But Jonathan, you know, on this...
Piers, I think we should address something, you know, on the topic of numbers and, you know, these big, important, historically loaded terms like genocide, like apartheid, like famine. Let's revisit, and I think that there's people who have been claiming and saying that there's famine in Gaza. Famine was declared by the IPC, I believe, on August 22nd. Now, a friend of mine has done the numbers on it, and I think it's important to be specific here because there are definitions, and when you say famine, that means something. When a UN organization claims that there's famine somewhere, that's supposed to be backed up by data and by reality. Now, according to the numbers and statistics and the globally accustomed numbers of the IPC, which they follow, they issued a declaration that on August 22nd, there's famine in certain parts of Gaza. By their own numbers of level 4 and 5, emergency and famine, there should have been 9,500 dead Palestinians by malnutrition, not natural deaths, not combat, not pre-existing conditions, 9,500 dead Palestinians since August 22nd. You know how many there really have been? According to Hamas numbers, 191. That's 98% off. Now, I challenge you and I challenge everybody who have been screaming and were part of the starvation campaign and the famine, all of the other nonsense that we heard with UN regalia attached to it. At the end of the day, it's a fake. It's lies. It is not supported by reality. It's make-believe, and it is propaganda against Israel that useful idiots who have no bearing on the situation on the ground are parroting just because it is a weapon
but you
against
wouldn't dispute,
Israel.
Jonathan.
It is untrue.
But Jonathan,
it is not factual.
Okay,
we,
but hang on,
we can
hang
see
on,
the photos, right?
Hang on, but Jonathan, you wouldn't dispute that there was a near 3-month blockade of substantial amounts of food and aid. I mean, that was indisputable. That happened.
There were indeed months where not a lot was coming in, yes.
Right. But that's
true. But the important part, Piers, but the important part is what was the result? The important part is, okay, that was done by Israel and it was said by Israeli leadership. It was challenged by the defense establishment, and there were a lot of internal discussions. But at the end of the day, when UN-affiliated organizations declared famine, and every journalist, editor, media personality, and talking heads repeated that as if that was gospel, nobody looks at the numbers. And even today, a month and a half after that, is anybody held accountable for these libellous, false, grotesque claims?
Well, why
Isn't
don't we,
it supposed to mean something
why
when
don't we
you
agree?
say
Why don't
that
we
there is a
agree?
famine
Okay,
and
so why don't
almost
we?
nobody's
Abby, I will
died?
come to you. So why don't we agree? Rather like with genocide, right? I have believed that the rhetoric coming out of Smodrich and Ben Gvir in particular has made it clear there's been a policy by large sections of this government of ethnic cleansing. They would like to see all the Palestinians gone from Gaza and preferably the West Bank too. Thankfully, in this new plan, that is no longer apparently something that will be sustained by the American government, which means it probably won't happen. But let's not pretend they weren't talking about that openly. And in relation to famine, OK, let's just say there was a deliberate policy for nearly 12 weeks of starving Palestinians, and that some of them starved to death. I mean,
there wasn't a policy of starving Palestinians. There was a policy of not providing the
in other words, I think these words, in a way...
We've spoken about this.
But hang on, let me finish.
We have spoken about this.
We have.
But you've addressed this, really, and we've spoken about it in the past. There was indeed an Israeli policy. And by the way, I reject and I criticize and I do not accept the statements made by Smodrich and Ben Gvir. I think that they are disgusting. I think that they are not representative of Israel. I think that they are fringe. I know we've had this discussion before. He's a minister in cabinet, etc. But I think that they do not represent the majority of Israel. And most importantly, they are not implemented on the ground by the IDF. And amongst the three of us, actually the one who knows what the IDF is doing and what the IDF isn't doing and what goes on in internal deliberations in Israel, I actually have access to that, and I can say, and that's one of the reasons why I am here and I speak about it publicly, is yes, there have been horrible, unethical calls by Israeli ministers that should be condemned. I condemn it. Most Israelis do, and they do not reflect what Israelis believe should be done. Is there a will for revenge against Palestinians for what they have been doing and what they did on October 7? Definitely yes. But that is not what the IDF has been doing. The IDF has been fighting Hamas, and they have been applying military force proportionately according to military necessity against military targets.
All right,
that is what the IDF has been doing.
Okay.
And if we're honest, last sentence, yes, I know I'm speaking longly, last sentence, Israel is the only country that has been forced to provide food and fuel to its enemy. If you can give me any other example in modern history of a combating side that is forced to feed.
It's the law. When you're illegally besieging
no, it's not the law.
It's
not the law.
Let
feed your enemy.
Right. Yes, it is.
Yes, it is.
No, it is not the law. It is not the law. It is not the law.
Hang on. I'll let you have a good long stretch
Jonathan,
there.
you've been talking
Let
endlessly.
Abby now respond without interrupting her. Abby.
I haven't interrupted at all, just to be clear.
Okay, of course, because you've just been droning on and on with the most outrageous propaganda possible, basically saying, oh, they say that this many kids died of starvation, but really, that's a lie. We've seen the photos, Jonathan. It's skin and bones. It's like concentration camp victims coming out of the Holocaust. Do you know that we see this? I know that Israel's like to control the narrative with the billions of dollars with Hasbro propaganda, but we see the photos of starving children. We see doctors' testimonies saying baby formula was seized out of their bags. Baby formula. Why are you punishing babies? We know what the situation on the ground. Peanut butter was told to doctors that it was a luxury and stolen out of their bags, Jonathan. For the last 2 years, we've been told, not even talking about the siege before where calories were counted, given to Palestinians before October 7th, but just since October 7th, we've been told that there's no siege, there's no famine, that aid is not being prevented from being delivered, right? Well, we just saw an entire naval fleet committed an act of piracy and kidnapping of 500 activists illegally in international waters that were trying to bring baby formula and food to starving Palestinians. We've seen a mercenary force unload a barrage of bullets and kill more Palestinians begging for bread than civilians died on October 7th. So while people like you, these hand-picked spokespeople with American or Swedish accents, come and speak to Western audiences and placate us and tell us lies, we know what Israeli society thinks and believes, Jonathan. We see the news. I see Israeli Channel 12. I see the IDF reports. Of course I do. I see them coming out saying, guess what? Everyone left in Gaza City, the 250,000 people left, are going to be treated as terrorists and killed. Jonathan, I just let you speak forever. Jonathan, let me finish. Jonathan, let me finish.
Either stop saying my name.
You will be remembered no differently than the officers of the Third Reich. You will be remembered no differently than the officers of the Third Reich. You will be remembered in the dustbin of history.
I know you rehearsed that line.
Oh, come
I'm sure you
on,
rehearsed that line, but it's really pitiful. Come on, you can do better. You're a smart woman. You can do better. You've written books. You've narrated movies. You could do better. And I'm a bit insulted that that is what you've come up with against me. Really?
Well, what's your response to the rest of what I said, Jonathan? So you don't want to be compared to a Nazi officer.
I'll gladly tell you.
Why would you compare
in the beginning?
Abby, let me just jump in there.
I mean, you're so out of bounds.
Hang on, Jonathan. Abby, out of interest, why would you think that anybody watching this, when they hear you tell a Jewish man that he's basically a Nazi,
the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor, by the way, whose grandfather's family was murdered.
That is a winning point to make. Why would you not think in that moment, a lot of viewers go, what the hell are you talking about? Why would you be so offensive?
Well, it's not offensive at all. It's not offensive at all. If you want to not be compared to Nazis, stop acting like Nazis. It's very simple. Stop doing what Nazis did and stop treating Palestinians like Jews in concentration camps, Jonathan.
You are in your little eco bubble. you're so. I think you're consumed
No, you
by
are,
hatred
my friend.
And the fact that in
The world has woken
when,
up, my friend. The
when
world
peers,
has woken up. No one
No,
believes
no,
your lies anymore.
No, it hasn't.
You're pathetic.
And I don't think that
you're
we're
pathetic
friends. I don't think
propagandist.
that we're friends.
You're an absolutely pathetic
no,
propagandist,
not at all.
and
But
no one
when
believes
you in the
you.
beginning,
No one
when
believes
Peers
you.
gave you a long lifeline.
Israel's on a shelf
Peers
life,
gave you
my
a
friend.
long
Zionism
lifeline,
has
and
a
he
shelf
asked
life.
you, why does Hamas have your legitimacy in your eyes? Why should Hamas even hold weapons? And you fumbled and stumbled, and you couldn't bring yourself to say, well, actually, no, Hamas shouldn't have weapons because they're bloody heinous terrorists. That's the response that I would,
I think
it makes
Israel
sense for a
should be
person like you to
demilitarized,
say.
Jonathan.
But you couldn't bring yourself to say it. Why?
Israel
Because
should
you
be
sympathize with
demilitarized.
them.
Of course, I'm not
because
going to
you
say
believe
it.
that their resistance is legitimate. You believe, I'm sure, that Israel is very annoying and that we shouldn't
I believe in the
exist
law,
where we
Jonathan.
are. I've seen
I
your
believe in the
movies.
law.
Yeah, no, you don't believe in the law. You don't believe in the law. You
Yeah,
believe
I
that we
do.
don't have a right to
I
exist
do.
in our homeland.
I want
I've
Israel
seen your
to-
movies.
I
I've
want
read
Israel
some
to
parts
be-
of your books.
All right.
I've seen what you've done in Gaza. You've been
Okay.
propagating for Hamas.
Israel should
That's
follow
what
the
you've
law,
been doing.
Piers. Very
And you
simple.
couldn't
The
even
solution
bring
is
yourself
Israel
to
to
say-
follow the law.
I think
you couldn't
everybody,
even bring yourself
everybody
to say
should follow the
Hamas
law.
shouldn't have weapons.
Everyone should follow the law. I've got to leave it
Everyone
there.
should follow the law.
We've run out of time, but I thank you both very much. Thank you.